Thank you, Father Peter. Thank you, Dr. Butcher. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being present on this wintry night. Hello, John. I am not an expert in Eastern Christian thought, neither in its patristic nor in its later forms. So that is one deficiency which I bring to this topic, which was assigned to me more or less. Therefore, I come at it as an Augustine scholar. But I think I still may have some interesting observations about the book that I was asked to review. Orthodox Readings of Augustine is a volume of 13 short papers by as many scholars, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, presented at a conference held from June 14 to 16, 2007 at Fordham University. The volume was edited by Aristotle Papanikolaou. I'll apologize in advance for my pronunciation of Greek and Russian names. And George Demokopoulos, and was published by St. Vladimir's Seminary Press in 2008. So it's this 10 years ago, 11 years ago that the book has been out. In what follows, I shall offer a brief summary of each of the papers along with a personal evaluation. The difficulty of the project envisioned by the conference that led to the publication of this volume was cogently identified by David Bentley Hart in his chapter in the volume. Quote, it's a long quote, so.
It's probably one sentence.
Great. There is that. The immediate context of this essay is a conference on the Eastern Orthodox understanding of Augustine's theology, conducted by Eastern and Western Christian scholars together and convoked in the hope that their shared efforts might help to dispel certain of the misunderstandings haunting relations between the Greek and Latin traditions. This is a project admirable in its ambition, obviously, but also one that innumerable obstacles conspire to thwart. In any modern engagement between Christian East and Christian West, we begin from the long history of an often militant refusal on both sides of intellectual reconciliation. More to the point, we begin from very different theological grammars and with terminologies that can achieve only proximate correspondences, and from within conceptual worlds whose atmospheres are not perfectly congenial to one another's flora, and from a settled tradition of mutual and frequently willful incomprehension. All too often, moreover, this incomprehension takes the depressing form of a simple and deplorable failure of imagination, an inability to appreciate that, in order to understand another intellectual tradition rooted in a different primary language, it is not enough to translate its terms into one's own dialect and then proceed to interpret them according to the rules of one's own tradition. And the consequence of this is that, as often as not, ecumenism between East and West consists in little more than a relentless syncope of category errors. End of quote. Hart cites as an example of such category errors, quote, arch dismissals of Eastern understandings of grace as semi-Pelagian by doctrinaire Augustinians, end quote. As a way of introducing the project of this volume, in their essay, Augustine and the Orthodox, the West in the East, Aristotle Papanikolaou and George Demokopoulos briefly outline the reception of Augustine in Eastern patristic and Orthodox churches from the early period until today. One of the key themes of this opening chapter is that the Orthodox traditionally have not read much of Augustine. Up until the 13th century, Augustine was either ignored or assumed to be authoritative simply on the basis of reputation. Why the negligence, they ask. One possibility is accessibility, which implies the issue of translation as well. A case can be made that Augustine was significantly read by the East, especially post-Reformation. A case can be made that accessibility was a real complicating factor in the reception of Augustine by the East. Once Augustine was significantly read by the East, especially post-Reformation, the Orthodox began a more sustained engagement that resulted in a number of critiques, ones associated with Augustine's Trinitarianism, his rejection of the divine essence energies distinction, and his purported dismissal of apophaticism. One of the leading critics of Augustine, the authors explain, was John Romanides. With the exception of Vladimir Lossky and maybe a few others, Augustine in the 20th century has been thought to be part, maybe even one of the initiators, of Western Christianity's rationalization of theology, a move that stands in tension with the prominent Eastern theme of theosis. The authors quote Romanides. Romanides, I apologize. Quote, St. Augustine himself does not appear to have accepted this essence-energies distinction. Speaking about the procession of the Holy Spirit, he makes a clear confusion between essence and energy in God. This identification of essence and energy in the West led Western theologians to articulate the thought that God is pure energy. The articulation of the above thought is also due to other philosophical presuppositions of Augustine, such as his faith concerning knowledge of the essence of God, end quote. This is John Romanides, An Outline of Orthodox Patristic Dogmatics, which was translated into English and published in 2004. According to Papanikolaou and Demokopoulos, I'm getting better at that, Romanides essentially extends Lossky's critique of scholasticism back to Augustine, to whom he attributes its foundation. However, they criticize Romanides' work on the basis of his lack of familiarity with Augustine's texts. Moreover, they note that on those rare occasions when Romanides does cite Augustine's works, his references frequently consist of mistakes or false attributions. The authors hold that Christos Yanaras, Yanaras,
but everybody says Yanaris, that's fine.
Christos Yanaras, would agree with Romanides that Augustine's rejection of the essence-energies distinction was the beginning of the emergence of a distinct Western theological and cultural ethos, but that Yanaras would amplify this claim by arguing that the sources of the absence of this distinction lie in Augustine's rejection of I know how to say this too, and I can't. Apophaticism. Yanaris, they point out, writes that Augustine's theology was decisive, offering an ideal basis for a differentiated Western version of Christianity, one that is diametrically opposed to that formed within the Byzantine East. John Zizoulas, according to Papanikolaou and Demokopoulos, follow Romanides and Yanaris in attributing to Augustine's thought the basis for theological errors in the West. For Zizoulas, the problem with Augustine's thought does not lie in his rejection of apophaticism or the essence-energies distinction. In his own theology, Zizoulas is little interested in these issues, but instead in his Trinitarian theologies. For Zizoulas, in line with Sergei Bulgakov, Augustine prioritizes the essence of God over the Trinitarian hypostases. Demokopoulos and his colleague rightly point out that Zizoulas is followed here by two Western theologians, Catherine Lacuna and Colin Gunton. Demokopoulos and his colleague point out that not all Orthodox theologians share Zizoulas' take on Augustine, notably Bulgakov. It is remarkable how positive toward Augustine's Trinitarian theology Bulgakov is, according to Demokopoulos and his colleague, and more recently, Dumitru Stalinou, who appropriate Augustine's love analogy in their respective Trinitarian theologies. Demokopoulos and his colleague conclude by pointing out that anti-Augustinianism only really emerged in the 19th century, when Ottoman and Tsarist Russian efforts to westernize provoked anti-colonial sentiments among church leaders and intellectuals, but that the common thread in the contemporary Orthodox critique of Augustine is the perception that he prioritizes philosophy over theology. This particular critique, however, only began to take shape in the generation of Greek theologians of the 1960s. I found that remarkable. Prior to this generation of Greek theologians, Augustine's status as a father of the Orthodox Church was never questioned, though aspects of his theology were critiqued, especially his understanding of sin and grace. And here I have to tell a joke, if I may. So, Augustine's understanding of sin and grace becomes one of the points of controversy between the Byzantine East and the Christian West. I once heard Kallistos Ware lecturing at Oxford about this matter. And he said, and I can't imitate his voice, otherwise I would try. He said, the Orthodox too believe that Adam fell, but not as far as Augustine. Which kind of gets at it from two angles. The opening essay by Demokopoulos and his colleague marvelously sets the table for the discussions that follow in this volume. It is not surprising that a good share of these essays treat Trinitarian issues in Augustine in some fashion or other. So I will introduce these discussions first. The most heated among them, and the one most relevant to the issues as set out in the introductory chapter, is that between David Bentley Hart and David Bradshaw. I omit institutional affiliations because in some cases they have changed or are currently changing since the volume was published. Both of their essays also intersect that of Jean-Luc Marion. Marion, in his essay Id Ipsum, The Name of God According to Augustine, posits the thesis that Augustine's notion of being is analogous to that of Pseudo-Dionysius, and more forcefully than Losky, Marion situates Augustine in the Christian apophatic tradition. Offering a close reading of the Confessions, Marion traces the limits of Augustine's purportedly omnipotent intellect, reminding us that when faced with the impossibility of speaking of God, Augustine speaks to God. Predication thus gives way to praise, according to Marion. Augustine's God, then, is no mere object of cognition. He is not ipsum esse, being itself, but rather id ipsum, the self-same. Not being, but rather immutability, beyond the scope of being. In his essay, The Hidden and the Manifest Metaphysics After Nicaea, David Bentley Hart admits that there are a number of reasons to dislike Augustine, including, and these were just too many for me, but not including his increasingly intransigent extremism regarding the creature's merit, his hideous theology of predestination and original guilt, the eternal damnation of infants who died unbaptized. In short, the entire range of his catastrophic misreading of Paul's theology. I almost shut the book and walked away from this. That having been said, he holds that this air of tragic moral idiocy surrounding Augustine's late works should probably be disregarded as the product of intellectual failure. In other words, we should stop making such a big deal about it. Hart takes a similar approach to the de regnum paradigm, which he dismisses as dauntingly imprecise, to Losky's and Zizulis' charge of essentialist impersonalism, which cannot be justified by a single sentence in Augustine's work, so Hart argues. And to Augustine's alleged conflation of the divine essence with the divine energies, which Hart calls a sublimely pointless argument. The bottom line for Hart is that whether the fathers claim that illuminated souls see the divine essence or participate in God's energies, or whether they call God being or beyond being, they are saying the same thing, which is that God is the transcendent source and end of all things, end quote, who reveals ever more of himself and yet always infinitely exceeds what he reveals. To insist that this position can only be attained by means of a strict separation of essence and energies is, says Hart, little more than pious nonsense. He has rather strong opinions, this fellow. The position outlined by Hart stands in stark contrast with that of David Bradshaw in an essay entitled Augustine the Metaphysician, who insists that the difference between Augustine and the Greek fathers is both complicated and significant. Against the position outlined by Jean-Luc Marion, Bradshaw claims that Augustine's God is not beyond being or beyond intellect. And against Hart, he insists that the distinction does matter. Bradshaw concedes that from Confessions to the sermons and the commentaries, it is clear that Augustine's God exceeds speech and thought. But, he argues, God remains an object of noesis, an object of intellect, rather than a source of mystical union. Two errors lead Augustine to this abandonment of mysticism, according to Bradshaw. First, his rejection of apophaticism, which Marion contests, and I do as well. Bradshaw seems unaware of the groundbreaking researches of the Dutch Augustine scholar Paul van Geest on Augustine's apophaticism. And two, his conflation of God's essence and energies, which Hart dismisses. Without a distinction between the knowable manifestation of God, and the unknowable ousia of God, Bradshaw suggests, Augustine renders humanity both too far and too close. God is mystically unattainable, yet in principle fully intelligible. So whereas Marion would insist that Augustine's God is beyond knowledge and being, Bradshaw would insist that he is not, and Hart would deny that the difference makes any real difference at all. To these three essays, those by Joseph Lienhard, Louis Ayres, and John Baer, concerning, in some form or another, Trinitarian theology must be added, thus rounding out treatment of this issue in the volume. Joseph Lienhard's article, Augustine of Hippo, Basil of Caesarea, and Gregory Nazianzen, traces the extent of Augustine's knowledge of the Cappadocians. He does this by hard tracking Augustine's own scattered references to the two Greek fathers, culminating in Augustine's appeal to Basil's insight that the sin of Adam and Eve affected all their descendants. In other words, Augustine's highly contentious doctrine of sin and grace is not simply a Latin invention, according to Lienhard. Lienhard concludes that Augustine knew Basil and Gregory mostly through Latin translations. The works Augustine quoted directly are not Basil's or Gregory's central works, at least according to modern perceptions. He quoted Gregory Nazianzen more often than he quoted Basil, perhaps because he had read Rufinus's Latin translations of 9 homilies available to him. He writes of Gregory's great name and most celebrated reputation. Gregory's eloquence, he writes, has the merit of great grace, and his works have been translated into the Latin language. Shortly thereafter, Augustine again praises Gregory's authority for this reason. What Gregory says is known to all as the Christian faith. Louis Ayres, in his essay Sempiterne Spiritus Deonum, Augustine's Pneumatology and the Metaphysics of Spirit, is concerned globally with Augustine's place in the Filioque controversy and with misunderstandings concerning it by some among both Catholic and Eastern Orthodox theologians. For Ayres, Augustine's pneumatology is still frequently misunderstood. He believes that a correct reading of Augustine's pneumatology will show possibilities for Augustine's thought to unite rather than divide East from West. His argument is that Augustine offers an extraordinarily sophisticated account of the Father as principium of the Trinitarian communion of Father, Son, and Spirit as irreducible persons who together constitute the Trinitas quae est Deus. Augustine's vision of the Spirit as the active giving love breathed by the Father as the foundation of the Trinitarian communion provides the wider and essential context within which we must consider those aspects of his pneumatology that are easily taken out of context and used as the basis for unhelpful polemic. Ayres challenges specifically the charge that Augustine's Trinitarian theology begins with an identification of the one God with the divine essence. That is, he challenges the claim that Augustine prioritizes an impersonal divine essence over the personal relations, demonstrating that the communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit constitutes the divine essence in the first place. And this is right at the heart of the Eastern Orthodox critique of Augustine's Trinitarianism. Turning specifically to the Filioque discussion in Augustine's De Trinitate, Ayres argues that, and I quote, Exegetically, the foundation of Augustine's discussion of procession is the matrix of texts drawn together by his mature consideration of why the Spirit is the Spirit of the Father and the Son. Ontologically, his understanding of the Spirit's procession rests on his sense of the character of the divine being. The Father's begetting of the Son is identical with the establishment of the communion of Father, Son, and Spirit, because in the beginning of the Son, the Father gives his love or substance, thus eternally establishing the Son as lover of the Father and the Spirit as the personal giving love of Father and Son. Louis Ayres and I have been friends for 30 years. I completely agree with his summary of the Filioque question in Augustine and with his exegesis of the passages from De Trinitate concerning it, specifically with his conclusion that in the beginning of the Son, the Father gives his love or substance, thus eternally establishing the Son as lover of the Father and the Spirit as the personal giving love of Father and Son. Ayres reaches similar conclusions regarding the Filioque to those advanced by my former colleague at the Patristic Institute in Rome, Father Nello Cipriani. In a paper delivered at a 2009 Orthodox Catholic dialogue conducted in Rome between professors of the Patristic Institute and the Theology Faculty of the University of Thessalonica, Cipriani examined closely the nexus of scriptural references and interpretations that Augustine utilized in De Trinitate in explaining the double procession, to the pleasant surprise of the Greek Orthodox theologians present, who admitted that they had not been aware of just how scripturally based Augustine's reasoning is. And that was I was present at that conference, and I witnessed the surprise with which the Greeks received that paper by Father Cipriani. So we do have a lot of work to do in Trinitarian theology, specifically in Augustine's Trinitarian theology. Advancing an altogether different assessment of Augustine's Trinitarian theology from Ayres is John Baer. Those two have an ongoing kind of disagreement. Who in his essay, Calling Upon God as Father, Augustine and the Legacy of Nicaea, admits that Augustine's Trinitarian theology has yet to be seriously explored by any 20th century Eastern Orthodox writer. That's incredible. I'll read that again. This is from John Baer, who is Orthodox. Augustine's Trinitarian theology has yet to be seriously explored by any 20th century Eastern Orthodox writer. I mean, I'm quoting Baer. It's extraordinary. I mean, what are we talking about? You know, we're not reading the texts, and we're reading about the texts, and we're reading about the texts from people 100 years ago, and it's just... Nevertheless, Baer argues that the Augustinian approach to the doctrine of the Trinity is one that is not discernible in the Eastern patristic texts of the 4th century. He contrasts Gregory Nazianzen's hesitation, my word, hesitation, in calling the Holy Spirit God, with Augustine's total unawareness that in using the term God in terms of the Trinity, he is introducing something radically new, and that it is problematic to do so. The concern of the Cappadocians, quoting Baer here, the concern of the Cappadocians following Athanasius, Origen, and Irenaeus was not the implications of how one affirms that each divine person is God and the one God singularly and collectively, but the reverse, to affirm that the one God is Father. Now, if Baer is right about this, and I'm not sure he is, but if he is right about this, this is significant, I think, that only the Father can be called God. Baer hesitatingly admits that later, unspecified, Byzantine writers do speak of the trihypostatic God for reasons he says have yet to be studied, and so he knows that his argument is restricted primarily to the Cappadocians, and this is another interesting point. What is the history then of the naming of the Father alone as God in the Byzantine tradition? And why would later Byzantine authors refer to the trihypostatic God when the Cappadocians apparently don't? But he is comfortable with this limitation. Baer's essay ends with the curious proposition that Augustine does not treat only the Father as God, but also the Son and the Holy Spirit. And in saying this, he seems to me to miss all that has been said in Augustinian scholarship about the role of the Son and the Holy Spirit in revealing the Father, as Augustine does in De Trinitate, Book 4. Baer also can't seem to cope with Augustine speaking about the interrelationships of the divine persons in the way he does, as it seems to Baer to be too mythical or metaphysical. In moving away from the papers in this volume dealing specifically with the Trinity, I do not mean to place the remaining essays in a second or third tier with respect to those essays. After all, the book is not about Trinitarian issues exclusively or principally, but about the entire Augustinian oeuvre and its reception in Eastern Orthodoxy. Elizabeth Fisher, whose essay is titled Planudes, De Trinitate, The Art of Translation and the Beholder's Share, illuminates with unprecedented clarity the context surrounding Planudes' translation of Augustine's De Trinitate, while Reinhard Flogaus's essay, Inspiration, Exploitation, Distortion, the use of St. Augustine in the Hesychast controversy, evinces convincingly that Gregory Palamas not only knew of this translation, but extracted from it lengthy quotations. Flogaus also shows how this appropriation of Augustine by Palamas has gone unnoticed in contemporary scholarship on Palamas, and may have something to do with the inability on the part of Eastern Christian scholars to admit of any Western influence on the person whose work is perceived to be the culmination of the Eastern patristic tradition. Brian Daly is the only author in the volume to deal with the disputed question of sin and grace. In an essay titled Augustine and Maximus on Sin and Human Salvation, Daly explores the parallels between Maximus the Confessor's and Augustine's post- and pre-Chalcedonian Christologies, concluding rather anticlimactically that their residences are probably accidental. This is a shame. I'm not a Maximus scholar, but when I used to sit in on dissertation or even license thesis discussions by students who wrote on Maximus under very professional guidance and supervision, I was amazed at how much of Augustine I heard coming through Maximus. I'm just really amazed by this. And I would ask the question during the discussion whether the individual thought that Augustine could have been a source for Maximus. No one thought that he could, and apparently Brian Daly doesn't either, which is a shame. I mean, that we can't establish any kind of a source, Augustinian source for Maximus. It is worth noting that Demacopoulos and his colleague, in their superb opening essay, note that some 20th century Roman Catholic theologians have openly rejected Augustine's teaching on sin and grace, and conclude that, quote, since Vatican II, Augustine's view on sin and grace can no longer be isolated as a major point of dispute between the Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions, end quote. I'm not sure they're right about that. They name some Catholic theologians, Karl Rahner, Gustavo Gutierrez, others, as having rejected Augustine's teachings on sin and grace. I mean, what does that mean? Nature and grace, yes, of course, Rahner would. But I don't think I don't think we're finished with this issue between the West and the East, between Augustinians and Eastern Orthodox theologians. I just have a feeling it's going to still be around. The essays of David Tracy, Andrew Louth, and Carol Harrison challenge Christians of all traditions to go beyond the usual suspects of Augustine's corpus, which include Confessions, De Trinitate, and De Civitate Dei, the City of God, and to look at ignored or forgotten aspects of Augustine's work, especially his sermons, now marvelously translated anew in English, and I would add his psalm commentaries and his commentary on Johannine writings. Augustine as pastor does not mean Augustine has stopped being a theologian. And these largely unexamined works of Augustine's corpus may serve as a point of departure and point of unity for the Christian reassessment of the value of Augustine's thought. Can Augustine be reread in such a way that the East-West divide does not become an anachronistic mechanism for further agonistic exchanges? Such possibilities are contingent upon a revised hermeneutic. Often in the West, Augustine is used and called upon for very specific reasons, and many of these are well rehearsed. Certainly, classics like the ones mentioned above, Confessions, De Trinitate, continue to inspire the minds and hearts of readers, but the polemical Augustine, the one who responded to the Manichaeans, Donatists, Pelagians, and others, is the one who is often cited and appealed to for such key themes as predestination, the nature of grace or free will. The pro-Nicene Augustine, the proto-Chalcedonian Augustine, the mystical Augustine, or the pastoral Augustine have rarely made their way into conversations regarding the legacy of the church bishop. These approaches are gaining more of a hearing today, are courageously explored in this volume, and represent potential avenues in which further ecumenical conversations can continue to take place. In her essay De Profundis, Augustine's reading of orthodoxy, Carol Harrison suggests that this Augustine is far less dogmatic than his over-analyzed counterpart. His sermons and letters betray a complex and unavoidable undercurrent of ambiguity, difficulty, and obscurity. She argues, not unreasonably in my view, that this unavoidable undercurrent constitutes the dark side to Augustine's conception of orthodoxy, considered as the right faith or recta fides. I quote Harrison at length a bit here. I would like to suggest that if we look not beyond but within the seemingly monolithic, immovable, and immutable fixity of this sort of orthodoxy, this is lowercase orthodoxy, we will find a darker side, an unavoidable undercurrent of ambiguity, difficulty, and obscurity, of fluidity, change, and flexibility that unless it is acknowledged and consciously appreciated, can only lead to unexplained conflict, disagreement, and potentially dangerous fractures and divisions. The image that comes to mind is of the plates that make up the Earth's surface. They seem fixed, and on the basis of that reassuring fixity, we describe them, allocate names to places, create maps and atlases, identify geological characteristics, and so on. Yet we are all aware that these vast plates are slowly, inexorably moving and changing, that at any minute they might erupt or clash to change things forever. End quote. As evidence for her argument, Harrison points to Augustine's theory of signs in De Doctrina Christiana in respect to the proper interpretation of the scriptures, church teachings, and the sacraments as sources of orthodoxy. The ambiguity that Augustine admits as existing in interpretations based on words as signs pointing to a reality that is knowable only through a hermeneutic of love leads Harrison to conclude that Augustine's dogmatic utterances are perhaps less stable and intractable than they may seem. She posits the possibility for greater flexibility in Augustine's appeals to orthodoxy than many scholars have traditionally admitted. I must admit that I find much of what Harrison is developing in this paper to be attractive, and her insights dovetail with some of my own work on orthodoxy. Nevertheless, while she is partial to what she calls the dark side of Augustine, I do not think that she has successfully integrated it into the Augustine whose dogmatic pronouncements, in my view, leave little or no room for flexibility, let alone for evolution. Harrison used to refer to herself, I know her too, as an irenic person who does not like controversy. I do not think this latter Augustine must be seen as less humble. That is, the doctrinaire Augustine, the polemic Augustine, must be seen as less humble than the Augustine Harrison champions. Augustine thinks himself dutifully compliant to what for him is the indisputable outcome of reading signs which, even and especially when read in charity, oblige the Christian community to profess inflexibly certain dogmatic positions. One need only think of Augustine's position on the indissolubility of marriage and the inadmissibility of divorce and remarriage in contrast with certain Eastern Orthodox theologies and practices. David Tracy's essay, Augustine's Christomorphic Theocentrism, examines this dark side to which Harrison turns revealing the Augustine who stared into the ultimate terrifying void and never quite recovered, who was always a Christian in convalescence. Tracy expresses some fascinating presuppositions which guide his interpretation of Augustine. Firstly, in the multiple texts of Augustine, as well as in the texts of his many admirers and critics from his own time until today, Augustine has always been both a famous and controversial thinker through the avalanche of conflicting receptions of fragments of his work through the centuries. Think about that. We very often don't know integral texts of Augustine, or they weren't known through the centuries. What were known were fragments. Florilegia, for example, in the early medieval period. He goes on to explain that in Augustine, the texts themselves have become fragmentary. I find that really fascinating, to be honest with you. Sometimes complementing one another, sometimes merely stranded next to one another like sunken ruins, sometimes seeming to contradict one another. For example, says Tracy, it is not easy or perhaps even desirable to try to render coherent all of Augustine's positions on free will. Lastly, Tracy is positive about this difficulty in Augustine's text. And here's a line that just really struck me. Only period pieces yield to a once and for all interpretation. Classics never. Let me repeat that. Only period pieces yield to a once and for all interpretation. Classics never. Thus, the fragmentary imagination of Augustine can be viewed not as a defect, but as an advantage. Tracy brings his insights concerning the fragmentary Augustine into his reading of the crux of Augustine's theology and religious experience, Jesus Christ. Tracy makes much of the fact that Augustine never wrote a single Christological treatise, and that his Christology has to be assembled from fragments scattered unsystematically throughout his writings. Nevertheless, Tracy holds that it is precisely Augustine's Christology that is the key to understanding his ponderous oeuvre. Like Harrison and Louth, Tracy is at pains to stress that there is another Augustine beyond the dogmatist and polemicist, one that is pastoral, less inclined to give offense and, well, pleasant. Nevertheless, I have to admit to feeling rather disappointed by Tracy's essay, especially after its tantalizing introductory section on the fragmentary of Augustine. His summary of Augustine's Christology is basic and somewhat derivative, and I have no idea what the essay is doing in a collection dedicated to the Eastern Orthodox reception of Augustine, because he never mentions Eastern Orthodoxy, nor does he allude to it. One has the feeling that Tracy wrote this essay with a different occasion and a different audience in mind. Andrew Louth's essay, Heart in Pilgrimage, St. Augustine as Interpreter of the Psalms, opens with a bold premise. The obstacles to a true appreciation of Augustine by the Orthodox are fundamentally the same as the obstacles faced by Western Christians. I'm going to repeat that. I think that's wholly insightful. I've just never heard anything like that. But the obstacles to a true appreciation of St. Augustine by the Orthodox are fundamentally the same as the obstacles faced by Western Christians. I've never heard this asserted before, but I suspect that Louth is right. His essay goes on to confirm the importance of an Augustine whose ideas are more often tentative, not definitive. Another one-liner that I think makes us think. Augustine's ideas are more often tentative, not definitive. Louth points out, and Louth does read Augustine, and this is you have to carry. Yeah, right, he does. Louth points out helpfully that the problem with understanding Augustine, both for the East and the West, is that we think we understand him perfectly well already. Virtually no one comes to Augustine with no preconceptions. And these preconceptions usually have to do with choice themes that are promulgated about Augustine. Louth's piece is simultaneously an exceptionally learned piece of scholarship and a mediating pastoral reflection. He focuses the spotlight on Augustine as preacher, examining the bishop's homily on Psalm 100 and not on the Augustine of the great controversies. Describing his methodology as an exercise in seeing how Augustine read one of the Psalms with his congregation, Louth allows Augustine's exegesis to lead the discussion while adding to the theological intricacies of the sermon and demarcating the major themes or emphases important to Augustine. Louth's concluding remarks sum up well his intent for the piece. Quote, "At this level of pastoral concern and psychological insight, we can all, Christians of both Western and Eastern traditions, find a voice that still has a great deal to say to us all." End quote. Conclusion. There you have it, 13 essays that broadly consider Augustine's reception by Eastern Orthodox theologians across the centuries, but especially in the 20th century. In closing, I would like to highlight especially some of the methodological points raised in these essays that I think particularly noteworthy. I begin with David Bentley Hart's summary of the difficulties facing dialogue today between the Christian East and the Christian West. As I pointed out at the beginning of my paper, Hart notes that East and West begin from very different theological grammars and with terminologies that can achieve only proximate correspondences, and from within conceptual worlds whose atmospheres are not perfectly congenial to one another's flora, and from a settled tradition of mutual and frequently willful incomprehension. I would ask whether we really deeply accept this premise. That's me speaking. I would ask whether we really deeply accept this premise. I know from attending patristic lectures and conferences in and out of Rome that the only proximate correspondences between theological concepts among various early Christians is often not sufficiently taken for granted, especially where the use of translations is involved. So we don't pay enough attention to language. We don't pay enough attention to the differences, the subtle differences between terminologies in the Greek East and the Latin West, or between Greek writers and Latin writers. This is just to say that patristics need to be done more philologically than it has been if it's going to be true to itself. Turning for a moment to history, one of the concluding points of Aristotle Papanikolaou and George Demokopoulos bears repeating with emphasis that in the Christian East, up until the 13th century, Augustine was either ignored or assumed to be authoritative simply on the basis of reputation, and that one possibility for this negligence is accessibility, which implies the issue of translation as well. I would couple this observation with that of John Baer, that Augustine's Trinitarian theology has yet to be seriously explored by any 20th century Eastern Orthodox writer, and by Louis Ayres's view that Augustine's pneumatology is still frequently misunderstood by both Western and Eastern theologians. Once again, negligence of Augustine's texts by Eastern Orthodox theologians seems to be a problem for the Eastern Orthodox reception of Augustine's theology. Jean-Luc Marion's strong, in my mind, argument in favor of Augustine's apophaticism and David Bradshaw's hard rejection of it bring to mind David Tracy's hermeneutical point about the fragmentary Augustine. Remember that for Tracy, the avalanche of conflicting receptions of fragments of Augustine's work through the centuries seems to be very much the norm. Tracy goes on to explain that in Augustine, the texts themselves have become fragmentary, sometimes complementing one another, sometimes merely stranded next to one another like sunken ruins, sometimes seeming to contradict one another. In terms of Augustine's purported apophaticism, what Tracy's observation suggests to me is that Marion has paid far greater attention to the fragmentary nature of Augustine's texts where the silence and absence of God is concerned than has Bradshaw. In my own reading of Augustine over many years, I have come across these occasional apophatic references which, as I mentioned earlier, Paul von Geest has expertly synthesized in a monograph on this topic. However, rather than being seen as contradictory in a manner that calls into question the coherence of Augustine's thought, the positions of Marion and Bradshaw should perhaps be seen as seeming contradictions in an Augustine whose method is fragmentary. Here, too, we would do well, in my view, to recall the sage perspectives of Andrew Louth, who warns that Augustine's ideas are more often tentative, not definitive, and that the problem with understanding Augustine, both for the East and the West, is that we think we understand him perfectly well already. So, if you take all of these methodological points together and then look at the controversy between, say, Bradshaw and Marion over apophaticism, I wonder if that doesn't give us a way forward. And I would say the same in regard to Ayres and Baer on Augustine's Trinitarian theology. In saying this, we should perhaps return to Tracy's conclusion. Only period pieces yield to a once and for all interpretation. Classics never. and that the fragmentary imagination of Augustine can be viewed not as a defect, but as an advantage. Is the fragmentary imagination of Augustine at work in the question of the unknowability of God in his writings? Carol Harrison, David Tracy, and Andrew Louth make their point in strong terms when they argue that theologians of both Western and Eastern inspiration should go beyond the usual suspects of Augustine's corpus, which include the Confessions, the De Trinitate, and the De Civitate Dei, and look at ignored or forgotten aspects of Augustine's pastoral work, in part because the largely examined works of Augustine's corpus may serve as a point of departure and point of unity for the Christian reassessment of the value of Augustine's thought. Can Augustine be reread in such a way that the East-West divide does not become an anachronistic mechanism for further agonistic exchanges, they ask? The mystical Augustine or the pastoral Augustine have rarely made their way into conversations regarding the legacy of the church bishop. Now, while I am in sympathy with this viewpoint, and I said that already, I would raise 2 points. Firstly, the conference's theme was the reception of Augustine by the Eastern Orthodox, but the topics covered by Harrison, Tracy, and Louth step well outside of the issues that Eastern Orthodox theologians regularly raise concerning Augustine. It may be fair for these 3 scholars to suggest that Eastern Orthodox theologians should take up their respective topics, but this is not exactly the point of the conference. Secondly, I am not convinced, particularly not by Carol Harrison, that we can or should let go of the Trinitarian or soteriological anthropological issues, which, while they have been treated polemically at times, in the main have provided the grist for the East-West conversation about Augustine, even though I agree with Andrew Louth's perceptive comment that the obstacles to a true appreciation of Augustine by the Orthodox are fundamentally the same as the obstacles faced by Western Christians, so that we are not really always talking merely about an East-West divide over Augustine's thought. Tracy's point that there is another Augustine beyond the dogmatist and polemicist, one that is pastoral, less inclined to give offense, while true, and while there is, in my view, merit in discovering this other Augustine, nevertheless, what's wrong with polemic? What has the Academy to fear from honest, hard, even harsh disagreement over standpoints that matter to faith communities? I mentioned earlier, as an example in Augustinian terms, the older debates being revisited in recent scholarship over differences between Augustinian and Eastern Christian views on matrimony, divorce, and remarriage. Simply because these topics have been dealt with before in scholarship does not mean that they should not be researched and discussed anew, especially when the issue is recently revived in Roman Catholic theology. Meanwhile, should John Baer and Louis Ayres or David Bradshaw and David Bentley Hart just abandon their feeding frenzies over Augustine's Trinitarianism simply because disagreement is untidy? Once again, I would suggest that Tracy's fragmentary Augustine might help both sides in these debates to find ways of reaching greater mutual accommodation of views, if that is desirable, and it may not be. Thank you.